Allora, per poter visitare l'Independence Hall qui di Filadelfia, dove c'è il parco con la campana rotta, dovete venire all'ufficio turistico qui in questo desk Independence Hall, lì dove c'è scritto il ticket here. È gratuito, vi danno il ticket e poi bisogna presentarsi qua di fronte, lì, un quarto d'ora prima dell'inizio. Una volta passati i controlli di sicurezza, qui nel telone rosso, si deve aspettare in questo punto che arrivi la guida per farci il tour. Vi faccio vedere il biglietto, la mappa del luogo. C'è scritto che bisogna presentarsi un quarto d'ora prima dell'inizio del tour, visto i controlli.
Chairs are nice and wide, and you have to move it.
Where we do introductions, brief introductions. The introduction is not going to have to last for too long. A lot of times there's actually a tour in front, which is the reason why we have to kind of slow things down a bit here. However, since you're the first tour of the day, we obviously don't have that problem. So we'll be headed over there in just a moment. And you will soon be seeing a room looking very much like the painting that you see there on the wall. That is the assembly room of Independence Hall. And that is in fact the place where America's two most important and most famous founding documents were debated over and subsequently signed. And of course these two documents are the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Now when the tour is over, that doesn't necessarily have to conclude your time on the square. There are a couple other buildings that you're welcome to stick around and see as well if you do have the time. The other is the west wing of this building, so obviously that's the one on the other side of the main attraction. And there's a walkthrough exhibit there where you can see original prints of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, as well as the inkstand that was used for signing them is there as well. And another treat that we have over there, it was just put out on display just the other day, the Declaration of Common Aims, which is the first time in 99 years that this signed copy of this document is actually being displayed to the public. What is the Declaration of Common Aims? Well, as we are in the centennial of the First World War, aka the Great War, the war to end all wars, even though obviously it didn't really quite turn out that way. But either way, at the end of the First World War, there were leaders from Central European nations, including places like Czechoslovakia, that gathered together inside of Independence Hall, and in fact with the same inkstand that was used for signing the Declaration of Independence and Constitution, these leaders would actually use that inkstand to sign the Declaration of Common Aims, which basically stated in so many words that these peoples of Central Europe were no longer going to submit to oppressive forms of government. Yeah, 20 years later, I know. But either way, nonetheless, it was certainly a powerful statement to make. So I would certainly recommend sticking around to see that after this tour. Another place that you can visit is Congress Hall, which is the building on the far corner of the square, a very important historic structure as well. It is, in fact, the oldest surviving federal congressional building in the nation. When Philadelphia served as America's temporary capital during the 1790s, this was a time in which Washington, D.C. was being built, quite literally from the ground up. That building was the home to our legislative branch of government. What makes that building so historically significant is that's the place where these ideas about self-government here in the United States and Republican democracy were actually put to the test. But the building that you are about to see momentarily, that's the building where, of course, these ideas were hatched, where ideas about government, self-government, and again, Republican democracy created. All right, so do any of you have any questions at all for me before we head over? All right, well again, hope you brought your cameras because you may take all the pictures you like. If you'd all please follow me this way. things here before you. Number one is it is 9 o'clock. That means probably most of you have not yet seen the Liberty Bell, because that building in fact opens at 9. That's right across the street. That does not need a ticket. It's open all day today till 5 o'clock, so feel free to see it any time before then. Before we enter these doors though, I want to point out to you some landmarks here immediately in front of us. The statue of course George Washington, somebody whose life is certainly intricately tied with many of the events that took place in this building. Just to the right, we have two plaques here where historic events took place. The one on the far right over there, John F. Kennedy actually stood on that spot for a speech that he delivered here on the interdependence of nations. The one just to the left of that is where Abraham Lincoln stood for a flag-raising ceremony in 1861. He was actually on his way to the White House to be inaugurated our 16th president that year, but stopped off here, as I mentioned, for the flag-raising ceremony. And also he gave an impromptu speech right afterwards, in which he actually stated that he would rather be cut down by assassins' bullets than betray the principles that had been established here in this building. Now, Abraham Lincoln would take one more trip to this building 5 years later, although this time in a casket. He actually lay in state inside of the assembly room of this building. All right, folks, let's have a look inside. Alright, so folks, you perhaps weren't expecting to see a courtroom inside of this building as the first stop. Why are you in a courtroom right now? Well, this reflects one of the 18th century uses of this building. You probably could have guessed it was not actually built to be the birthplace of the nation. It was built to be a colonial government building. And to be a bit more specific than that, it was built to be the Capitol building for the colony of Pennsylvania. And as such, it housed all three branches of the Pennsylvania colonial government. This building's official name, by the way, not really quite as exciting sounding, I suppose, as Independence Hall, the Pennsylvania State House. Although not really quite as glorious sounding, I guess a bit more reflective of the initial purpose for this building. Now, the room in which we're in right now, this was for the judicial branch. The Supreme Court for the colony would have convened here. Although trials of all sorts took place in this space, whether they involved the Supreme Court or otherwise. And in fact, where you're all standing right now is, I guess you might say, appropriate historically speaking, because you are standing in the public space. Trials, it was very common for trials back then to be open to the public. And the room was supposed to present a very welcoming atmosphere to the public as well. That's why you've got those very wide archways behind you. That was really kind of the idea being expressed here. I guess also, in a sense, you might say that this room is somewhat representative of many aspects from Great Britain that America actually decided to keep, even after the War for Independence. For instance, our legal system is very similar to Britain's even still today. For instance, with jury trials, and of course the theory, at least theory, that you're innocent until proven guilty. There are a couple of aspects that have changed from then till now in terms of the makeup of a courtroom. Maybe one of the most obvious ones is the cage that you see right here. This is referred to as the prisoner's dock, where the accused would stand if a trial were taking place here. Of course, today we're kind of used to the scene in courtrooms where the attorney is sitting alongside his or her client. But back in those days, the attorneys all sat together in at the same common table, which would be the table with the green cloth there. Another aspect of this room that is a reminder of what we decided not to keep has to do with what you see there hanging on the wall. The coat of arms representing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is in fact one of the few original pieces to this building. The building itself, structurally speaking, is mostly original. Its exterior brickwork we gauge at somewhere between 80 to 90% original. Interior woodwork a little less than that, about 70% or so original. Most of the pieces that you see here before you are period pieces, or, well, actually specifically in this room, they're a mixture of reconstructed pieces as well as period pieces. Although the assembly room behind you, we're going to be headed in just a 1785. If you would come into this room, however, at the dawn of the American Revolution, of our War for Independence, you would have seen a different coat of arms hanging up there. In fact, we have a picture of it right here that I can show you. That's what I think of it. Of course, this coat of arms represents a very different form of authority, the monarch of Great Britain. Now, as to why it's not hanging up there anymore, well, most of you can guess why it's not up there anymore, but how it was taken down has to do with a dramatic episode that took place here on the date July the 8th of 1776. That was the day of the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence, which took place right out here in the back courtyard of this very building. When the reading was completed, some militiamen who had been in the crowd that day came into this room, removed this coat of arms, took it outside with them, and subsequently dropped it in a bonfire. And I'm sure through the eyes of many, this was a great, brave, patriotic act, something to be celebrated. After all, here these audacious colonists, these rebels, were being so brave as to thumb their noses in the faces of authority. But through the eyes of others, this would have been considered a serious crime. Of course, that crime being treason. But I guess on the list of treasonous acts that were committed on these shores during the summer of 1776, this might have actually fell relatively low on the list. And on that note, that's actually a good time now to take you to the assembly room, where these treasonous rebels hatched a few plots, to say the least. All right, if you all do an about face and head in that direction, we will meet up there. So now we are in the assembly room, and if you will recall to mind the painting where we started the tour, this room should look familiar to you. The initial purpose of this space was for the Pennsylvania Colonial Legislature, but the Continental Congress would begin using this in May of 1775. Now, in May of 1775, this was of course a little bit before America's Declaration of Independence, but at this point, if you would ask most Americans, including most of the members of the Continental Congress here, what exactly it was they were fighting for, a likely answer would have been that they were fighting for their rights as free-born Englishmen. So the notion of fighting for independence was an idea not really quite so prevalent at the beginning of this conflict, but really rather as the conflict progressed. But as ideas for independence began to take hold and gather momentum, they did spread relatively quickly. And in fact, a little more than a year later, by the early summer of 1776, many Americans, including also many of the members of the Continental Congress here, had in fact come around to regarding independence as the desired outcome. In early June of 1776, a motion was put on the table here in this room, which read, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." Now, the motion had been made, but there was still a lot of division amongst the delegates here as to whether or not this was the proper course of action, the right way to go. But as a result of the motion being made, it was decided that it would be a good idea, and largely to get Americans on the same page here for a common understanding of what it was this fight was all about, a good idea to draft a document, one which would serve as an official statement to let the world know the justification for the cause of independence. To draft this official statement, Congress would appoint a committee of 5 delegates. And amongst those 5, that committee of 5 was a young Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. Now, as I walk over here to the, quote, Virginia table, I should add the note here that we don't really know for a fact where everybody in this room would have sat. The reason why the room is set up the way it is, however, has to do with a seating chart that was made in the year 1782. That's when the Continental Congress was still meeting in this room. And it has the delegates seated here from north to south in the room, depending on where they were from in the colony. So, for instance, over here on this side, the northern side of the room would have been where your delegates representing New England states, as well as places like New York, New Jersey would have been. Over here, the south, of course, the southern side of the room, this is where your southern delegates would have been. And the Virginia table placed right here. And by the way, even though I said a short while ago, it's mostly period pieces that wouldn't have been here in the room over 200 years ago. I did also, though, say there were a few exceptions to the rule. We do have some personal effects, which we do know did belong to certain delegates of note. We have one piece of furniture also that we can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt would have been here, and that's the chair on the raised platform. That's the chair that George Washington would have presided from as president of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. But getting back to the Virginia table right here, the black walking stick that you see did in fact belong to Thomas Jefferson. Now, once Thomas Jefferson accepts the task of coming up with this document, because amongst the Committee of Five, it's eventually whittled down to this gentleman to be the primary author, the primary drafter, although interesting to note here, it seemed like nobody seemed to particularly love the job all that badly. But once Jefferson accepts it, he will come up with a rough draft of this document in about 2.5 weeks' time. And the majority of the document will consist of a long list of grievances against King George III, who are commonly regarded to be the British King's most egregious offenses. Now, 27 grievances in all would make the final cut. And these included articles like levying taxes on the colonists without the colonists' consent. If you remember from your schooling days that old rallying cry from early on in this conflict, no taxation without representation. That's what this clause refers to. Other clauses like hiring foreign mercenaries to come here to these shores to suppress the king's own subjects, keeping standing armies here in the colonies in times of peace, cutting off American trade with all parts of the world. When Jefferson, though, introduces the rough draft here to his colleagues, not everybody's going to share his enthusiasm for all the finer points that he's making. And after several days of debating, there are going to be over 80 changes made to it. Now, amongst the changes that take place will include the elimination of a rather controversial clause on the slave trade. Actually, in fact, which condemns the king for being a profiteer of the Atlantic slave trade. Well, many of the members of Congress didn't feel that this was the time or the place to deal with this controversial issue. In other words, figuring that they had kind of a little too much on their plate at the moment. So I guess you might say in so many words, they decided to table it to be dealt with at a later time. Of course, that later time would not end up happening within the lifetimes of anyone who signed the Declaration of Independence, or Constitution for that matter. And of course, here what I'm referring to is the American Civil War. Of course, this is the very bloody event to occur in this nation over 80 years later, in which the issue of slavery is finally once and for all settled. But all that being said, of course, this part of the document that's certainly the best remembered today, or at least the most oft-quoted anyway, is a part which has nothing at all to do with this long list of grievances. And I'm sure most, if not all of you, know the line that I'm about to say. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But as stirring and as inspiring as that line may appear to us, certainly, and I guess justifiably so, should not necessarily overshadow what comes immediately after. It continues, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And this might actually be the most radical statement being made here. And perhaps in the 21st century, we've somewhat lost touch with all that such a statement might imply. But you do have to bear in mind that over 200 years ago, most of the world's governments were monarchies. And this line was seen as a direct assault against what was argued to be the arbitrary authority of monarchy. The point is further being emphasized here that it is the people who should be the check on their government, as of course opposed to it being the other way around. Now, while the document was still being debated over here in this room, the date July the 2nd would roll around, and even though the document itself had yet to be approved, it did not stop the members of Congress from voting on the question of independence. The vote on that day would go in the affirmative, that is for separation from the mother country. And the very next day, Massachusetts delegate John Adams here, perhaps overwhelmed with emotion in the moment, will write a letter home to his wife Abigail. And this comes across as an almost prophetic sounding letter. He predicts that from thenceforth, every July the 2nd, This is going to go down as the most celebrated day in American history. It's going to be celebrated with fireworks going off, with games being played, marching bands, of course, many of the same ways that Americans still celebrate Independence Day down to the present. I assume that you already know that there's something slightly off with this prediction.
2 days.
2 days, yes, very good. 2 days. With all due respect to John Adams here, he was 2 days off in what is otherwise a very prescient prediction. But if July the 4th has any justification for being chosen as the most celebrated day, that would be the day that the document, the Declaration of Independence, would be officially adopted by the Continental Congress. Now, what I'm holding for you here, folks, is a copy of how this document looked when it was run off the printing press for the very first time. After it was approved here in this room, and just to reiterate, that did, of course, happen on the 4th, it was immediately rushed to a local printer who mass-produced it on the press, the purpose being to get the word out to the public. And the fact that he actually made the decision to put the date up here as July the 4th, this may have had as much as anything to do with cementing the idea in people's minds that this was, in fact, the most important date. Now, by the way, as I mentioned, this is, well, obviously a copy, but if you do want to see the real thing, one of 26 surviving copies from its very first printing, you might remember I mentioned at the beginning of the tour in the West Wing, that's the building that's right next door to us behind you, that actually has one of these copies. And in fact, it's believed that that was the copy that was used for the very first time it was read out loud to the public. That's the story I talked about when we were in the courtroom. Now, as to its actual signing, this actually happened a month later. August the 2nd was in fact the date that most of the delegates put their names to this document. I imagine you can probably guess that this is a copy too. There is in fact only one signed copy of this document, and that's on display in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. But as to their waiting so long, a lot of myths actually circulate as to why they waited so long to put their names to the document. But the primary reason, more than anything else, it was not yet written out in the fancy longhand form that you see here, but for another, it was not even mandated that there be a signed copy of this document until the middle of July. So in fact, several weeks after the document had been approved. Now, when you take these factors into consideration, you may draw the conclusion, as I think many people do, that putting their names to this document maybe not such a big deal. Consider the fact that they didn't mandate that there be a signed copy of it until, again, several weeks after independence had been declared. But should you be inclined to go down that road, consider the situation this way. What if this rebellion had been lost by the American colonists? Well, instead of this going on to be considered quite the revered document, a document that many Americans argue is essentially our family charter, it probably rather would have ended up being Exhibit A in a treason trial. So pretty damning evidence right here, if in fact that were to have been the case. And certainly something also to be said for putting your name to a document which could have in effect been your death warrant. Now the fight to win independence would continue for another 7 years, finally concluding in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. But at this point, Americans had something of a new struggle on their hands. Now, if you would ask most Americans at this time what they had won with their independence, you probably would have heard a few people at most say anything like that they had won their freedom to be one singular sovereign independent nation. Rather, you might have heard something sounding more like that they had won their freedom to be 13 independent states. Now, at this point, America's framework of government, or first rules of government, often referred to, by the way, as being its first constitution, was called the Articles of Confederation. And it explicitly mentions in the Articles of Confederation that the states maintain their sovereignty. Now, under the terms of the Articles, there was in fact a centralized government, which in fact continued to be the Continental Congress, or by then it was often interchangeably referred to as the Confederation Congress. But this Congress, what served as a centralized government, was left relatively weak. For one thing, it had no taxing authority. And as Americans would soon quickly discover, there were in fact some very essential needs for taxation, and where they seemed to feel the pinch the most, or at least the soonest, had to do with national security. Without the ability to tax, there was no way of raising any kind of military to counter threats, whether they be internal or external. Nor, for that matter, was there any way that the centralized government had of regulating commerce between the states, or of, settling their various border disputes, which were already by that point occurring. By the year 1787, the situation was perceived by some as coming dangerously close to unraveling altogether, to the point where some prominent Americans, by permission of their respective state governments, decided upon holding a convention here in the city. Again, choosing this space as the place to meet. Now, there were some familiar names to this convention, people who had been around during the summer of 1776 and penned their names to the Declaration of Independence. Among them, George Read from Delaware, Roger Sherman from Connecticut, and of course, Pennsylvania's own Benjamin Franklin. But then there were a lot of new names to surface as well. Notably, from Virginia, an individual often referred to rather flatteringly in our history books as the, quote, father of the Constitution, Mr. James Madison. Now, as to why he's referred to as father of the Constitution, at the beginning of the convention, he was the primary author of a plan referred to as the Virginia Plan. And this plan, probably if anything, came the closest to seeming as a blueprint for the finished product, the Constitution itself. Arguably, it would be the Virginia Plan. This was a plan that called for a form of government at the national level, divided into three separate branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And it's also from jumping the gun there, Madison's recollections here in terms of what we know took place during the debates at the Constitutional Convention, because he was very attuned to keeping notes of all the meetings that took place here. Another individual who, of course, you all know this name because Broadway's just made him a star, or you might know him otherwise, but Alexander Hamilton from New York. And this is an individual that many historians give credit, perhaps more than any other delegate to the convention, for actually getting this convention to occur in the first place. So Mr. Hamilton here, kind of a mover and a shaker, I guess you might say. Now, the Constitutional Convention lasted for a little over 4 months, between May and September, again the year being 1787. And the initial purpose of this convention, at least as many delegates saw it, was to discuss ways of amending the Articles of Confederation, just tweaking it a bit here and there where it was needed, or adding amendments to it. But the delegates in this room rather by far exceeded their initial instructions by scrapping the Articles of Confederation entirely and composing a whole new set of rules of government. And it is fair to say that not all the delegates here particularly approved of what was transpiring, and felt rather uncomfortable with the fact that they were exceeding what they perceived as their initial instructions. And it did seem, in many instances, with the feuding and the bickering that took place in this room over this roughly 4-month period of time, in often cases it seemed as if the meetings were going to fall apart, and ultimately no consensus reached. But finally, by the date September the 17th, in a show of solidarity, the names of 39 delegates to this convention went on the finished product. And by that, of course, I mean signed the United States Constitution right here in this room. There was at least one delegate present who, despite all the misgivings of so many delegates here, including this person himself, who I'm about to refer to, despite all the misgivings, decided to be optimistic at what he perceived as a great achievement. And that delegate's Benjamin Franklin. And Franklin here chose to be optimistic, not simply because they had been able to overcome their differences enough and compromise enough, but that they had worked together to create something which for its time was considered quite revolutionary. In this age of monarchies, what they had worked together to create was a form of representative democracy. So to convey his enthusiasm in this, at the end of the convention, Franklin here makes reference to the chair on the raised platform. As I mentioned a short while ago, this is an original piece. The chair that George Washington presided from as president of this convention. And what Franklin says about the chair has to do with an emblem of the sun right up here at the top of his back. From where you're all standing, that's probably a little bit difficult to make out, but this woodcut replica will give you a pretty good idea as to what the real thing looks like. Franklin stated that while the debates were taking place in this room, he had often pondered upon the sun, wondering whether it was rising or setting. Now, of course, probably goes without saying here, he's not speaking literally but symbolically. He concludes his statement by saying, "Now at length I have the happiness to know that it is a rising and not a setting sun." And of course, here what he's stating is that his new nation was in fact just like the sun on the chair, also just beginning. All right, and on that note, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes your time here in the Assembly Room of Independence Hall. If, however, you don't need to leave right away, as promised, I can take you upstairs to the second level. I'll just say a few words in closing up there and allow you to browse it out on your own. Those of you who may happen to be pressed for time can exit through the south doors. That is the doors all on the courtyard side. All right, so you can just go right back out this doorway here, swing a left. The exits in the back or the stairs are also in the back will take you up. You're welcome. And the original colors as well. So, folks, if you were keeping tabs on what I was saying downstairs with regards to the Pennsylvania colonial government, I mentioned in the courtroom that was for the judicial branch. I believe I mentioned in the assembly room the initial purpose of that was for the legislative branch. I may have neglected that point, but I did mention it now. So that leaves one more, the executive branch, and that's essentially what this floor was used for. That area that we're in right now, appropriately referred to as the Long Gallery, was primarily a waiting area for people waiting to meet with Pennsylvania's governor, his council chamber, down at the far end over here. But also, as you can see, the way that the room's kind of, the table's decked out, as well as while there's a hard support on the east side of the gallery, really is to give the impression that social events took place here as well. Fancy parties, balls, and the like. The room on the other side has kind of an interesting history too. As the Continental Congress was meeting downstairs, the legislative branch for the colonies will have to continue their daily affairs. So I guess you might say so many words, they were booted up here to the second level, where they can continue their legislative duties in that room right there. Maybe a little bit more in line with the story of the birth of the United States, however, that room is also where the Pennsylvania Ratifying Convention was held. Now, of course, creating the Constitution itself was a very important piece of the puzzle, very large piece, but by far and away it was not the only piece. The rest of the nation had to get on board with it as well. So every state actually had to have its own ratifying convention. And Pennsylvania's, even though there certainly was a fair amount of anti-federalist sentiment here in Pennsylvania, that is, people opposed to the adoption of the Constitution, probably went a bit smoother than certain other states, like, for instance, Virginia, New York, Rhode Island, and North Carolina, which there was a lot of fierce fighting, and in a few instances it seemed like it just plain wasn't going to get passed in some of those states. But Pennsylvania would become the second state to ratify this new framework of government, just barely beaten to the punch by Delaware, hence that state's motto, the first state. All right, folks, so when you are ready to exit the building, you can just do so to the doors at the bottom of the stairs. But you do have another couple minutes up here, so you can feel free to take your time thinking about the rooms. Yes, Ross? Oh, yeah.